At the United Nations in 1992, Parliamentarians for Global Action, the PGA, an international network of politicians concerned with global issues, met to discuss environment and peacekeeping. This historic meeting stressed the role national legislators can play in world affairs. 2 years later, in 1994, some of the same legislators met again at Parliamentarians for Global Action's annual Executive Council meeting to update some of their earlier concerns and to focus on subsequent developments. From around the world, Parliamentarians for Global Action have gathered in New York to consider some of the increasingly global challenges of today. Their talks ranged over United Nations peacekeeping, world law, nuclear disarmament, and population. At their meeting, we talked with some of the parliamentarians on these issues. In recent times, atrocities of war and violations of human rights have given rise to calls for an international criminal court to serve as an international permanent tribunal on human rights. Leading PGA's call for such a court is Italian parliamentarian Emma Bonino.
The idea is that to have an instrument to which organization or parliamentarians or parliaments or state can refer to when they know, and report when they know that a human rights violation exists in some place of the world. And it seems to me the most important thing that the international community has to do right now, avoiding simply to complain afterwards and without knowing what to do. I think that the political debate is ready. What is lacking is the political will. The idea of a permanent court is absolutely needed by all who cares about human rights.
The horrors in Rwanda, Somalia, Bosnia, and elsewhere have also prompted calls for an early United Nations alert system to help prevent such situations from occurring, and calls for a rapid response standby force to move in when disasters do occur. PGA's treasurer, George Fuchs, a member of the United Kingdom Parliament, has been studying the possibilities.
The problem is, in instances like Bosnia, but even more so like Rwanda, the international community gets called on to try and sort it out too late in the sequence of events. And a number of us are of the view that, and this is where Global Action has been particularly involved, that it's necessary to try and identify these problems at a much earlier stage. And if we could have foreseen what was likely to happen in Rwanda, and perhaps also in Bosnia and indeed in other trouble spots, we might have been able more cheaply, before huge amounts of genocide take place, before the problem becomes frankly insoluble, to do something about it. And that's where the idea of an early warning network comes into being. And we are of the view that parliamentarians, not necessarily in the country involved, but in neighboring countries, know what's happening, can anticipate it, and ought to be mobilized more effectively to say, hey, wait a minute, this is going to be a big problem. The international community needs to get involved at an early stage. If, in spite of anticipation, or because there's no anticipation of the problem, then we need to have intervention by forces, by military forces. At the moment, the United Nations has great difficulty, first of all, in getting countries to agree those forces, secondly, in mobilizing them, thirdly, in paying for them, and it really is a huge logistical problem. Now, countries have rejected the idea of a standing army under the control of the United Nations, and I can understand that. There are huge problems there. But what we are arguing very strongly is that there should be, in as many countries as possible, troops and equipment which are earmarked for the United Nations, some of whom are specially trained for peacekeeping role. And they could be trained, they could be ready. Some of their equipment, helicopters in particular, could be earmarked for this purpose. And then when a particular problem arises and the UN Security Council decides that military intervention is necessary, they know that there are certain countries that have these troops earmarked, that have trained, perhaps trained together over a period of time with other countries, who can then be mobilized.
Parliamentarians for Global Action's continuing concern at the degradation of the global environment has been a subject of special concern for PGA member Senator Wakako Hironaka, Japan's former Director General of Environment. She has recently stressed the need for what she calls global fairness to ensure that developed nations do not seek to exploit some of the less strict environmental regulations in some third world nations.
You know, now the business is so international, so that, you know, the investors or business in advanced nations wants to invest in developing countries for cheaper labor and perhaps restrict environmental standard. But we should not take advantage of this. I think the idea of global fairness has to apply in the area of environment when we do business abroad. Global fairness means that if you don't want something to happen in your own country, then it should not happen in other countries.
With the end of the Cold War, new opportunities have emerged to hasten nuclear disarmament. Parliamentarians for Global Action have been at the forefront of the global effort to establish a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty and other proposals to move the world back from the brink of catastrophic nuclear war. PGA's Dr. Olafur Grimsson from the Parliament of Iceland has worked tirelessly to persuade nuclear nations to dismantle their arsenals.
We have been very active on this now for a number of years, and we have used all our political skills to move it along by being in a dialogue with members in the administration as well as in the parliaments of the nuclear weapon states and many other countries. And I think we have proved by that the methods that we are employing, they work. So therefore now we are starting another initiative which basically is based on this idea that the nuclear weapon states are still conducting their nuclear shop, if I call it like that, as if they are ready to fight nuclear war tomorrow afternoon. They have the aeroplanes on alert, they have the bombs in the missiles, they have the submarines sailing the oceans and so on. So now we are proposing a step-by-step reduction in the nuclear threat by gradually closing down the nuclear shop. To take that analogy further, to take an inventory of the nuclear stocks, then move the goods out of the window and from the shelves, put them into boxes and then store the boxes away. And we have just come back from meeting in Cairo 9 foreign ministers of countries that have agreed to preliminarily explore the possibility of putting forward at the United Nations a resolution calling for negotiations of a step-by-step reduction of the nuclear threat by taking such concrete steps as taking the aeroplanes off alert, moving the weapons, the bombs from the missiles, taking the missiles from the submarines, etc., etc. So gradually, we do not do away with nuclear weapons altogether, but gradually we start to remove the threat further back.
At the World Court in The Hague in the Netherlands, the 15 judges of the world's highest judicial authority have officially begun consideration of a case with profound global implications. the United Nations World Health Organization has requested a world court ruling on the legality of the use of nuclear weapons. According to the World Health Organization's brief, nuclear weapons represent a unique health hazard to all peoples of the world, and the use of such weapons should therefore be ruled not in compliance with world law. The judge's opinion cannot be enforced. It is a purely legal ruling. But a world court opinion carries considerable influence in the United Nations, which elects the judges to present the interests not of any nation, but of the world. All nations have been invited to make submissions on the question. The strongest national appeal to the World Court for a ban on the use of nuclear weapons has come from Maj-Britt Thorin, a member of the Swedish Parliament and former Swedish ambassador for disarmament.
It is a special joy for me to announce that Sweden today has responded and declared that use of nuclear weapons should not be in accordance with international law.
The case was initiated by the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the International Peace Bureau, and the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms. The case has also attracted the interest of some national groups of parliamentarians.
And quite some politicians have involved themselves. National groups of parliamentarians for global actions in Sweden, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and Ireland. And some of them have worked very hard. And many, many letters have been written to ministers of foreign affairs stating their responsibility.
More than 20 nations are expected to make submissions. The United States has announced that it will oppose any World Court ruling declaring the use of nuclear weapons illegal. Citizens have also written to the court. More than 100 million people around the world signed petitions supporting a ban on the use of nuclear weapons. Their petitions were accepted together with the World Health Organization's request for a ruling. In 1995, the United Nations will hold the first global summit meeting to consider world social issues. PGA's Murli Diora of the Indian Parliament has been following the preparation.
The United Nations has organized next year, in March 1995, in Copenhagen, a social summit, a conference to draw the attention of the world for the need of creation of more jobs, to give emphasis on poverty alleviation programs, to reduce social strife in our daily life. And Parliamentarians for Global Action is going to play a dominant role on this. We are mobilizing parliamentarians throughout the world. Some of them will come and attend the conference, to move in their own respective state legislation, national legislation, such programs that there's a need for economic reforms, there's a need for governments to undertake programs which would generate more and more jobs, and also to see that bigger financial institutions like World Bank, IMF, ADB, etc., their programs, their fundings should be directed towards this end, poverty alleviation programs.
Parliamentarians for Global Action now has more than 1,000 members from more than 70 nations. They are playing an increasingly active role in the United Nations, and particularly in the UN summit meetings on environment, population, and next year's meeting at the Social Summit. At the UN preparatory committees, PGA members have worked to have a direct input into the final draft of the summits. Shazia Rafi is PGA Program Director.
Parliamentarians for Global Action organized parliamentarian workshops to coincide with the timing of those preparatory committees. So first of all, by bringing the parliamentarians physically to the venue where the meetings are taking place and having a parliamentarian workshop before the meeting so that the input from that workshop is present in the form of a declaration or a statement is one mechanism that we use.
Mercedes Mas is PGA Program Officer who also worked on the PGA input into the Cairo Population Conference.
I think this is one of the most effective ways of working for our network, which is getting parliamentarians together, giving them information about issues of their interest, and then using our parliamentary network to directly approach governments to suggest specific courses of actions in different areas. And I think we were very successful in this workshop.
Dr. Kennedy Graham is PGA Secretary General.
To what extent is PGA cooperative with the United Nations? To what extent do you converge with the United Nations? Do you, to any extent, seek to actually lead or influence or shape the United Nations?
Well, PGA cooperates very closely with the United Nations. We have a very good working relationship, beginning with the Secretary General, now Dr. Beatrice Boutros-Ghali, who has attended a number of our sessions, has opened a number of our sessions, supports the work we do, right through the whole Secretariat. We have a lot of contact with the ambassadors, permanent representatives to the UN from various countries in the missions. There is a congruence of interest between the goals of the United Nations and the goals of Parliamentarians for Global Action. PGA tends to give collateral political support through parliamentarians and through parliamentarian action to a lot of the work the United Nations is doing. But if the United Nations is not proceeding as fast, and when I say United Nations, I mean the international community of states that form the United Nations. And there's a very important, subtle but important distinction to draw there. If progress is not fast enough on these issues by the international community of nations, then PGA will get in there and try to lead through the United Nations, certainly.
Dr. Ólafur Grímsson of Iceland explains the leading role PGA has played in advancing the United Nations call for a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty.
For many years, Parliamentarians for Global Action were campaigning for negotiations on a comprehensive test ban without great success. But we were, however, able to bring together over 40 nations that called for negotiations to start on the basis of the partial test ban treaty, which President Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed on in the early 60s. And that was a unique initiative taken by this organization that brought together in 1991 over 100 countries that had signed this treaty. And it played a great role in the policy decision by the Democratic presidential candidate in 1992 to commit himself to a comprehensive nuclear test ban. We worked on that issue with a number of members both in the House and the Senate in the United States, as well as in other countries. And this has now resulted in the negotiations really starting in Geneva earlier this year. And I went there together with Aaron Tovis a few months ago, and we had very good and confidential discussions with the representatives of the major nuclear weapon states as well as others. And I sincerely believe that all this effort is now finally bringing about a very serious and committed effort to try to get a comprehensive nuclear weapons test ban treaty before the middle of next year.
Emma Bonino of Italy talks of the role parliamentarians can play in helping advance the idea of a United Nations International Criminal Court.
They have a very important role. I think that this kind of issue, as others, but we are discussing this one, if they are led only to diplomats or experts or governments, all these kind of people, they are very good personally, but they are also too much cautious or sometimes timid. And I think that parliamentarians, with the link they have with public opinion, with their own constituency, can, not only can, they are the one who can really push through parliamentarian action, through public opinion involvement, through different kind of non-violent initiatives, because, well, people, they do not care so much of diplomacy, luckily enough. Diplomacy, and preventive diplomacy particularly, is a very important thing. It's absolutely needed. But it's also needed law and justice. And frankly speaking, I believe that there cannot be no peace without justice. And I really believe that individuals are the base, and people are the base of the international community. The UN, he is we the people. We the people with our rights and our duties, with our human and civil rights and with our duties. So the International Permanent Tribunal on Human Rights, on violation of human rights, is of utmost important. And the second point I wanted to mention is this one. When you pass a law at national level, you have a law prohibiting murder or whatever kind of crime. What do you do to people who violate them? Nothing? No, you have national judges, national trial, national police, who prevents and punish people who violate the laws. I think that this model should be applied in international relationship.
George Fuchs of the United Kingdom talks about the role parliamentarians are playing in helping to inform people about the importance both of a United Nations early warning system and a United Nations volunteer standby peacekeeping force.
That's what Parliamentarians for Global Action are involved in now, is trying to say, wait a minute, a lot of lives can be saved, a lot of money can be saved, a lot of effort can be saved if we anticipate and see these problems at an early stage. And slowly, more and more members of Parliament in more and more countries are working to try and persuade the governments that this is something should be done. It'll take some time, but I think that's worth working for. On the second one, it's a different problem that arises. I think there's an awareness of the idea. It's been around for for a longer period of time. People within the UN network and beyond have been suggesting this idea. The problem is the problem of the nation state, the sovereignty of the nation state, and concern that perhaps this is going to be lost. The control over their own troops might be lost by having these earmarked for the United Nations purposes. Now, I don't think that would be the case. That certainly would have been the case with a standing army, where you took regiments away from the country concerned and allocated them to a standing army under the control of the United Nations. But where all that you're saying is that there are these troops ready, subject to the sovereign decision of the country concerned, to be allocated to the UN for peacekeeping purposes, there shouldn't be any problem. But
Murli Deora of India explains how parliamentarians for global action are preparing their national governments for the 1995 United Nations Social Summit.
We have members of parliament in almost every country. So they create an awareness, or they go to their own national parliament. They talk in their own committees, the finance committee, economic committees, licensing committee, industrial production committee, employment committee, labor committee. These are the committees which are functioning in every parliament in every country. So the members of parliament can certainly have a very definite role at the national level as well as at the international level.
Professor Mona Makrem Abaid is a member of the Egyptian parliament and was PGA's leading spokesperson at the United Nations Cairo Conference on Population and Development. Women are strongly represented in PGA, but what about national parliaments? Are women playing a greater role?
They're not in number, they're not enough in number to play a greater role, but those who are try to, to make to leave as much impact as they can. They don't always tackle women's issues because they are there to be representatives of the people, really, not of women. So they tackle societal questions, and they tie it when it affects women in particular. In this case, of course, population is a very sensitive issue, but I think that men and women are equally aware of the concern, of the danger, and of the danger for the future for both North and Southern countries.
Parliamentarians for Global Action's international president is Senator Sylvia Hernandez of Mexico. She looks to the role of parliamentarians for global action in the post-Cold War world.
I believe that one of the major changes after the end of the Cold War is that a large number of countries in Eastern Europe are becoming democratic. In addition to them, there are also many African countries which are in the same transition. And I think that we parliamentarians are the best positioned people to make some contribution, to gather together with people in those countries and communicate among ourselves. We can share experiences. Many of them are failures, some other are successes, but I believe, I'm sure of it, that when we share the politicians' view, can learn from each other. And I think that could be one of the roles to be played by parliamentarians.
What then is the greatest long-term challenge facing parliamentarians for global action? PGA Secretary General Dr. Kennedy Graham.
I think it is to develop, without wanting to overstate this, a new philosophy that is being embraced by humankind, by the individual citizen of the planet, and start to articulate that and introduce it at the political level through currently elected parliamentarians in a way that begins to shed some light on how to solve global problems where there is a fair bit of darkness manifest at the United Nations when you have, as I said, 184 member states articulating 184 different national interests. If an organization, or many organizations, can develop a philosophy that shines some light on that, is a facilitator for resolving global problems at the philosophical level first, and then translate that into political action, because the women and men of our organization, 930 members in 78 countries around the planet, they are all currently elected. Therefore, they are all politically relevant to the immediate moment. And if they can translate that philosophy into political action through their parliamentarians, they will be doing this world a great service.
For Global Action Report, this is Kevin Sanders.